Large-scale accidents are rare, but devastating events in the world of heavy industry. Nuclear reactor meltdowns, mining collapses, oil rig explosions, and indeed factory fires, to name just a few, do indeed occur. One industrial disaster that you may not be familiar with took place on a cargo ship, with the resulting explosion killing hundreds and leveling buildings for miles around. In this installment of Well I Never, we look back at the 1947 Texas City disaster. Ammonium nitrate is an industrial chemical commonly used in fertilizers and as an explosive for quarrying and mining. It has also been used in instant cold packs and at one point as part of an inflator for airbags. When uncontaminated and stored correctly, it is generally considered relatively safe. But it becomes hazardous if contaminated or mixed with fuel, or indeed stored unsafely. When exposed to intense heat, large quantities of the substance can explode, so great care is taken to store and transport the chemical in smaller quantities and away from heat sources. In modern history, ammonium nitrate has been the chemical of choice for many terrorist and paramilitary organizations, such as those involved in the Irish Troubles to the Oklahoma City bomber. It was also cited as being used in the 2002 Bali nightclub bombings that killed more than 200, and many IEDs used in Afghanistan contained this highly reactive chemical. Even when not weaponized, ammonium nitrate has been responsible for thousands of deaths through disastrous accidents. As early as 1916, it was named the culprit in factory explosions across the United States and the United Kingdom. And as recently as 2020, an ammonium nitrate explosion in Beirut killed over 200, injured over 6,000, and left over 300,000 people without homes. The chemical was also the key component in the deadliest industrial accident in US history. The potential for a deep water port was first spotted by 3 duck hunters in 1891, who noticed that a location along Galveston Bay was positioned perfectly for use as a major shipping channel. The men, brothers from Duluth, Minnesota, named Benjamin, Henry, and Jacob Myers, convinced other investors to put up the money for them to buy the 10,000 acres of frontage known locally as Shoal Point. They renamed their holding Texas City, and by 1893 had established the Texas City Improvement Company, opened a post office, and convinced about 250 folks from Minnesota and Michigan to relocate to the city on the bay. The Texas City Improvement Company dredged a 40-foot deep shipping channel and built a railroad line to connect the port with Galveston, Houston, and San Antonio. So thriving was the port that by 1910, its depth and length had been greatly expanded, with 239 ships using its facilities. The Texas City Refining Company had also built a refinery to produce wax and lubricating oil next to the port. 3 more refineries followed shortly after, cementing Texas City as an essential harbor for deep-water shipping of petroleum products to the Atlantic coast. The 1920s brought a series of ambitious expansions, including a sugar refinery, a fig processing plant, a gasoline cracking plant, and a grain elevator. By 1925, Texas City was flourishing, with its population growing to nearly 4,000. By 1940, it was the 4th-ranked Texas port, exceeded only by Houston, Beaumont, and Port Arthur. World War II caused another boom of expansion, with the head of the Defense Plant Corporation building a tin smelter and petrochemical plant in Texas City. Monsanto Chemical Company was contracted to run the facility, but the many years of prosperity that Texas City was enjoying would end abruptly on the morning of April 16, 1947. The Grandcamp was a 437-foot-long Liberty ship carrying ammonium nitrate, small arms ammunition, machinery, and bales of sisal twine. The Grandcamp had just arrived from Houston and was preparing to deliver its cargo to Europe. After loading, the Grandcamp waited in the harbour near the SS High Flyer, which also carried ammonium nitrate as part of its cargo and about 1,600 metric tons of sulphur. Docked about 600 feet apart, the two massive ships were a common sight in the Texas City port. Around 8 a.m, smoke was spotted in the cargo hold of the Grandcamp. Dockers attempted to douse the flames with a gallon jug of water and 2 fire extinguishers, but their efforts were in vain. The captain ordered that hoses not be used, fearing water would ruin the cargo. Instead, ammunition was removed from the ship while other crew members attempted to restrict oxygen to the hold in the hopes of extinguishing the fire. Unfortunately, due to ammonium nitrate's chemical composition, it can burn without an external oxygen source. At approximately 9 a.m, flames were seen flickering from the hold, along with a column of yellow-orange smoke typical of nitrogen dioxide fumes. By now, a crowd had begun to gather to watch the developing situation. They would feel they were a safe distance from the flames as the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department arrived and began fighting the blaze. However, just moments later, the Grandcamp exploded. The blast was so powerful it was heard 150 miles away. Many people at the docks were killed instantly. The blast leveled nearly 1,000 buildings nearby and produced a 15-foot wave that swept through the port. The explosion destroyed the Monsanto plant entirely, killing 145 workers, and flying shrapnel ignited refineries and chemical tanks on the waterfront. 2 aeroplanes flying nearby were also blown out of the sky, and the ship's 2-ton anchor was later found 1.6 miles away. The massive ship's nearly 6,000 tons of steel were blown through the air, some at supersonic speed. 10 miles away in Galveston, windows shattered and people were knocked to their knees. The devastation was unfathomable. The entire port was in ruins and fires caused by the explosions raged. 27 of the 28 members of the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department who had been fighting the fire on board the ship now lay dead. The sole survivor escaping the same fate as he decided to stay home to complete work on his roof. Soon, locals began rescue efforts with the limited supplies they had at hand, but they were quickly joined by an additional 4,000 Red Cross workers and volunteers. However, fires and the general scale of the devastation made it difficult to reach the explosion's ground zero, and worst still, the destruction wasn't over. The Grandcamp explosion had rocked its neighbouring ship, the High Flyer, so violently its moorings snapped, sending it drifting across the harbour before coming to rest beside the Wilson B. Keene. Those who survived the Grandcamp blast evacuated, but later in the afternoon, 2 men boarded the High Flyer searching for injured crew. They noticed the cargo aboard was on fire and alerted someone on the harbour front. But in the mass confusion and panic, the message was ignored for hours until an official realised what a serious problem the secondary blaze could be. At 11 p.m, tugboats were dispatched to haul the High Flyer away from the docks, but they were unable to shift her. The fire burned all night, and the volunteers attempting to move the ship were evacuated. It's said that the fire was so fierce by this point that the ship's steel frame became glowing hot. At 1:10 p.m. the following afternoon, the High Flyer exploded with even greater force than the Grandcamp, flattening what was left of the port. Thankfully, the docks had been evacuated, so casualties from the second explosion were few, but chunks of glowing hot metal now rained down upon Texas City, igniting more fires. A propeller from the High Flyer was found nearly a mile inland. When the dust settled, it became clear that the destruction these 2 explosions caused was massive. More than 500 homes were destroyed, with hundreds more damaged, leaving some 2,000 people homeless. Over 1,000 vehicles were damaged and over 300 freight cars were demolished. Along with the destruction of refineries and other businesses at the port, the total property damage was estimated at $100 million, roughly $1.25 billion in today's money. There was also $500 million in oil products destroyed, close to $6.5 billion. In nearby Galveston, smoke from the burning oil and chemicals left the city coated in an oily residue, and Texas City itself was little more than a smouldering ruin. Even more devastating than the massive loss of property was the massive loss of lives. Morgues around the area were quickly overwhelmed, and bodies were laid out in the local high school's gymnasium for identification. Local, state, and federal officials descended on Texas City, working to identify victims for more than 2 months after the disaster. In some cases, the FBI matched fingerprints from unidentified remains, but 63 victims were never identified, despite the monumental effort, and nearly 200 people were reported missing. The estimated death toll was at least 581 people, with more than 5,000 injured. The real total could be much higher, with some believing that the deaths of many travelers, seamen, and undocumented workers were not added to the final tally. The exact cause of the fire on the Grand Camp was never identified. There was no evidence left and no surviving crew members to ask. Some speculated that it was likely a carelessly discarded cigarette that started the fire, but there's no way to know. The explosion ushered in one of the first class action lawsuits against the United States government on behalf of 8,485 plaintiffs in Elizabeth Dallahite et al. Versus United States under the recently enacted Federal Tort Claims Act, which allowed private citizens to sue the United States in a federal court. On April 13, 1950, the District Court found the United States responsible for numerous negligent acts by 168 agencies and their representatives in the manufacture, packaging, and labeling of ammonium nitrate. There was also negligence found in the transport, storage, loading, fire prevention, and fire suppression. But this decision was overturned by the US Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals 2 years later, and the Supreme Court affirmed that decision in 1953, noting that the District Court had no jurisdiction under the federal statute to find the US government liable for negligent planning decisions, which were properly delegated to various departments and agencies. The 3 dissenting justices argued that Congress has defined the tort liability of the government as analogous to that of a private person, noting that an individual would have certainly been held liable for such acts and as held to a higher standard of care than the government itself while carrying out inherently dangerous acts like the transportation and storage of explosives. The Dallahite decision was appealed to Congress, which granted relief through legislation. By 1957, Congress had given 1,394 awards, totaling nearly $17 million. In Texas City, Monsanto and other plants committed to rebuilding, and the city recovered surprisingly well, earning it the nickname, the town that would not die. US officials took note of the widespread destruction that had previously been thought only possible in the event of a nuclear explosion, and began developing its disaster preparedness plans. In 2005, the city suffered another explosion when a hydrocarbon vapor cloud at a BP oil refinery ignited, killing 15 workers and injuring 180 more. Hurricane Ike in 2008 devastated Galveston County, but Texas City was largely spared. Today, Texas City is still built on heavy industry and is a leading center of petrochemical refining. Ammonium nitrate is still used widely today And despite stricter regulations regarding its storage and transport, it remains a dangerous chemical. The Texas City disaster remains the 7th largest accidental non-nuclear explosion in history and the 3rd largest caused by ammonium nitrate. The propeller and anchor from the High Flyer and Grandcamp respectively now stand as memorials to those lost on that tragic day. Thank you for watching. If you'd like us to cover more disasters from the past, give this video a thumbs up or let us know in the comments below. Just a quick update, as you know, we deliver every Friday. However, on the odd occasion where we can't make that deadline, we post an update on our community tab that you can find here. We do of course apologise for those moments, but I can tell you we are working hard behind the scenes on some big projects that we're sure you're going to love. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.